The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek's newest subdivision when Margaret Rose Wheeler rolled her wheelchair to the window of her sister's modest home. The wooden ramp that had taken her brother-in-law 3 weekends to build stretched from the front porch to the gravel driveway, a simple structure that meant the world to both sisters. "Coffee's ready, Maggie," called Sarah from the kitchen, her voice carrying the same gentle warmth that had comforted Margaret through countless dark nights since the accident. Margaret had never imagined she'd need such accommodations. 2 years ago, she'd been Governor Margaret Wheeler, striding confidently through the state capitol, championing causes for rural communities like Willow Creek. Then came that rainy evening, the drunk driver, and the surgery that left her legs forever changed. The people had re-elected her anyway, but she'd quietly taken up residence in her sister's guest room, finding solace in anonymity and Sarah's unwavering love. "The HOA meeting is tonight," Sarah mentioned casually, setting a steaming mug beside Margaret's elbow.
"They want to discuss architectural compliance."
Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd heard the whispers, seen the pointed looks from neighbors, who viewed her ramp as an eyesore in their pristine development. The Homeowners Association had sent 3 increasingly stern letters demanding its removal, citing covenant violations. What they didn't know was that the quiet woman in the wheelchair held the power to approve or deny the federal grants that kept their community's infrastructure projects alive. But more importantly, what Margaret didn't know was that the new HOA president scheduled to lead tonight's meeting was someone she'd tried desperately to forget, someone whose memory still made her heart race despite 2 decades of separation. Chapter 2. The Ghost of Jackson Stone, 23 years earlier. Margaret Rose had been Maggie O'Brien, a spirited young woman working her way through law school while waitressing at Murphy's Saloon on the edge of town. Jackson Stone had been the drifter who rode into Willow Creek on a dusty motorcycle, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a past he refused to discuss. Their love affair had burned like a prairie fire, intense, consuming, and impossible to ignore. For 6 months, Maggie had believed she'd found her soulmate in the mysterious man with storm-gray eyes who quoted poetry and fixed engines with equal skill. Then one morning, she'd awakened to find him gone, leaving only a hastily scrawled note. "You deserve better than what I can give you. Don't look for me." She'd searched anyway, driving back roads and questioning every stranger. But Jackson Stone had vanished like smoke. The heartbreak had nearly destroyed her, but it also forged her determination. She'd thrown herself into her studies, graduated summa cum laude, and built a political career on a foundation of helping others avoid the abandonment she'd experienced. Now, as Sarah drove them to the community center that evening, Margaret's hands trembled against her wheelchair's armrests. The name on the HOA letter had been clear. Jackson Stone, President. It couldn't be the same man. Surely life wasn't that cruelly ironic. But when Sarah pushed her wheelchair through the community center doors, Margaret's heart stopped. There he was, older, grayer at the temples, wearing a pressed shirt instead of a leather jacket, but unmistakably Jackson.
Ow.
Their eyes met across the room, and she saw her own shock reflected in his familiar gaze. He'd returned to the one place she'd never expected to see him again. Chapter 3. Old wounds and new battles, ladies and gentlemen. "Thank you for coming." Jackson's voice carried the same low rumble that had once whispered promises in her ear. His hand shook slightly as he shuffled his papers, but his professional demeanor never wavered. "First item on tonight's agenda concerns architectural compliance violations at 247 Meadowlark Lane." Margaret felt Sarah's protective hand squeeze her shoulder. Her sister knew the whole story, the passionate love affair, the devastating abandonment, the years of healing that had led to Margaret's successful career and eventual marriage to David Wheeler, a kind man who died of cancer 5 years into their union. "The structure in question," Jackson continued, carefully avoiding Margaret's eyes, "violates our community covenants regarding unauthorized external modifications." "That structure?" Margaret found herself saying, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed through years of public speaking, is a wheelchair ramp. It provides essential access for a disabled resident. The room fell silent. Jackson's knuckles whitened as he gripped his papers. "Mrs.?" he prompted, though they both knew he recognized her voice as surely as she recognized his. Wheeler. Margaret Wheeler. She let the name hang in the air, watching his face carefully. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the same tell he'd had 23 years ago, when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Mrs. Wheeler, he said formally, while we sympathize with accessibility needs. Our covenants exist to maintain property values for all residents. Perhaps we could explore alternative solutions that don't involve permanent exterior modifications. The rage that built in Margaret's chest surprised her with its intensity. This man who had loved her, who had traced every inch of her skin with worshipful hands, who had promised her forever before disappearing without explanation, this man was now trying to take away the one thing that gave her independence? Alternative solutions, she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Such as interior renovations, perhaps? Or relocation to a more suitable property. The gasps from other residents told Margaret that Jackson had crossed a line, even the neighborhood. Busybodies recognized the cruelty in suggesting a disabled woman should be driven from her home. I see. Margaret's political instincts kicked in, masking her personal pain behind professional composure. And tell me, Mr. Stone, how long have you lived in Willow Creek? Something flickered in his eyes. I recently returned to the area. Recently, she nodded slowly. And in your recent return, have you familiarized yourself with the Americans with Disabilities Act? The Fair Housing Act? The constitutional protections that supersede private covenants when they discriminate against disabled individuals? The room buzzed with murmurs. Jackson's confidence wavered visibly. Furthermore, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, are you aware that this community receives federal funding for road maintenance, water system upgrades, and the very building we're sitting in? Tonight, funding that requires compliance with federal accessibility standards. She could see the moment understanding dawned in his eyes. His face paled as he realized exactly who she was, not just the woman whose heart he'd broken decades ago, but the governor who controlled the purse strings that kept Willow Creek functioning. I think, Margaret said, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room, this meeting is adjourned. Chapter 4. Confrontation under the stars. Margaret found him an hour later, sitting on the old wooden bridge that spanned Willow Creek, the same bridge where they'd shared their first kiss all those years ago. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and stars stretched endlessly overhead like scattered diamonds. You could have warned me, she said quietly, maneuvering her wheelchair to the bridge's edge beside where he sat with his legs dangling over the water. Would it have changed anything? Jackson's voice held a weariness that spoke of decades of regret. It might have saved us both some public humiliation. He laughed bitterly. I think I managed that all on my own. Governor Wheeler, huh? I should have known. You always were destined for greatness. Don't. The word came out sharper than she intended. Don't you dare make this about my success. You left Jackson. You made that choice. I know. We turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight she could see the lines that pain and time had etched around his eyes. I've regretted it every day for 23 years. Then why? The question she'd carried for over 2 decades finally escaped. Why did you leave without explanation, without giving me a chance to understand? Jackson was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I was afraid you'd try to save me and I wasn't worth saving. That wasn't your choice to make, wasn't it? He stood abruptly pacing to the bridge's railing. Maggie, you knew me for 6 months. 6 perfect, impossible months. You didn't know about the addiction, the gambling debts, the people who were looking for me. You didn't know that I'd stolen money to buy you that ring I never got to give you. Margaret's breath caught. What ring? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, worn smooth by decades of handling. I carried it for 23 years, Maggie, a reminder of the biggest mistake I ever made. With shaking hands, he opened the box. Inside nestled a simple solitaire diamond, modest but beautiful. The ring she'd dreamed about in her youth, before heartbreak taught her that dreams were dangerous things. You were going to propose? Her voice broke on the words. I was going to propose, and then those men found me. They made it clear that anyone close to me would pay for my debts. I ran because I couldn't let them hurt you, I thought. It would be easier for you to hate me than to mourn me. The pieces of a puzzle she'd carried for decades suddenly clicked into place. The hastily written note. The way he'd looked at her that last morning like he was memorizing her face. The jobs he'd mentioned losing. The phone calls he'd taken outside. The way he'd sometimes stared into the distance with fear in his eyes. You, idiot, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. You absolute idiot, I know. But Maggie, I need you to understand. Leaving you saved both our lives. I paid off those debts eventually, got clean, built something decent out of the wreckage I'd made, but I was never worth the risk to you. Still don't get it, do you? Margaret spun her wheelchair to face him fully. Jackson, I loved you. I would have faced anything with you. Debts, addiction, danger, I would have stood by your side and fought it all. You took that choice away from me. I was protecting. You were protecting yourself from having to trust me, from having to believe that someone could love you enough to weather the storms. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, gripping the bridge railing for support. God, Maggie, what did I do? What did I throw away? Chapter 5. The weight of years they sat in silence for a long time, the creek babbling softly beneath them. Margaret studied Jackson's profile in the moonlight. Seeing both the young man she'd loved and the stranger he'd become, the boy who'd read her poetry under these same stars had grown into a man weighted down by decades of regret and self-imposed exile. Tell me about the years between, she said softly. Tell me how you ended up back here. Jackson smiled sadly. It's not a pretty story. I'm not looking for pretty. I'm looking for truth. He nodded slowly. I drifted for a while after I left. Took whatever jobs I could find, tried to stay ahead of my past. Eventually ended up in Denver, where I hit rock bottom hard enough to bounce. Found myself in a treatment program, got my head straight, learned a trade, became an electrician. If you can believe that, I can. You always were good with your hands. The comment hung between them, loaded with memories of gentle touches and passionate embraces. Jackson cleared his throat and continued. Worked construction for 15 years, saved every penny I could. Met a woman named Linda Kind, patient. She knew about my past, accepted it, we married, and for a while I thought maybe I could build something good after all. Margaret felt a stab of jealousy, followed immediately by shame at her reaction. What happened? Cancer. 3 years ago. She fought hard, but he shrugged helplessly. Before she died, she made me promise to stop. Running from my past, said I'd never really live until I faced the things I'd left behind. So you came back to Willow Creek. What? Bought a house in Sarah's neighborhood, thinking maybe I could catch glimpses of the life I'd walked away from without disturbing it. I never meant to cause you pain, Maggie. I just thought I needed to be near the place where I'd been happiest, even if I couldn't be part of it anymore. And you became HOA president? Jackson laughed humorlessly. Seemed like penance. All those neighbors who needed their little problems solved, their disputes mediated. I thought maybe if I could fix enough small things, it might balance the scales for the big thing I'd broken. Till my ramp became a problem you had to solve. Till I realized that the woman whose life I'd shattered had built something beautiful. Despite my failures, and I was about to hurt her again. He looked at her directly then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Maggie, seeing you in that wheelchair, knowing you'd faced something terrible and survived it, it made me realize what a coward I've been. Don't. Margaret's voice was firm. Don't you dare pity me for this chair. This accident didn't break me, Jackson. Your leaving broke me. The chair just changed how I navigate the world. I know. God, I know. You're still the strongest person I've ever met. Still the woman who could take on the world with nothing but determination and heart. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself studying his hands older now, scarred from years of manual labor. But still the hands that had once held her like she was something precious. What happens now? She asked finally. What do you want to happen? It was a dangerous question, one that opened doors she'd thought permanently sealed. Margaret had spent decades building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the kind of devastating loss she'd experienced with Jackson. Her marriage to David had been built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passionate love. Safer, gentler, but never quite filling the Jackson-shaped hole in her soul. "I want to understand," she said carefully. "I want to believe that the man I loved is still somewhere inside the one sitting beside me." "He is," Jackson said quietly. "Older, wiser, hopefully less selfish, still crazy in love with a woman who deserves so much better than what he can offer." Chapter 6. The ramp's real purpose the next morning brought chaos. Margaret woke to find news vans lining the street and reporters clamoring for interviews about the governor's accessibility rights battle. Someone had leaked details of the previous night's HOA meeting, and the story had taken on a life of its own. Governor Wheeler. A young reporter thrust a microphone toward Margaret as Sarah helped her navigate through the crowd. "Is it true that the Meadowlark HOA is trying to force you from your home? Is this retaliation for your vote against the suburban development tax breaks? Are you planning to file a federal discrimination lawsuit?" Margaret raised her hand for silence, and years of commanding legislative chambers served her well. The crowd quieted, cameras focused, and she took a deep breath. "My sister and brother-in-law built a wheelchair ramp so I could visit their home safely and independently. Last night I was told that ramp violated neighborhood aesthetics and should be removed. I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about me. This is about every disabled person who's been told they don't belong. Their needs are less important than property values." She paused, letting her words sink in. The Meadowlark subdivision receives approximately $2.3 million annually in federal and state funding for infrastructure maintenance. Every penny of that funding comes with requirements for accessibility compliance. If this community wants to continue receiving public money, it needs to honor public accommodation laws. Governor Wheeler, another reporter, called out. Sources say the HOA president is someone from your past? Can you comment on potential conflicts of interest? Margaret's eyes found Jackson standing at the edge of the crowd, his face pale but determined. He stepped forward before she could answer. "Name is Jackson Stone, and I'm the current HOA president," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled reporters. "Last night, I made a serious error in judgment. I let personal concerns override my legal and ethical obligations to all residents of our community." The cameras swung toward him like hunting dogs catching a scent. "Personal concerns," a reporter pressed. Jackson looked directly at Margaret. She saw him make a choice, the choice he should have made 23 years ago. The choice to trust her with the truth, no matter how messy or complicated. 23 years ago, I was engaged to Governor Wheeler, he said simply. I left town without explanation, without saying goodbye, without giving her the respect she deserved. Last night, I compounded that mistake by trying to take away something that gives her independence and dignity. The crowd erupted in questions, but Jackson continued speaking. As of this morning, I'm resigning my position as HOA president. I'm also announcing that the Meadowlark Homeowners Association will not only allow Governor Wheeler's ramp to remain, but will be instituting new policies to proactively ensure all residents have equal access to community amenities. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Furthermore, I'm donating $50,000 from my personal savings to establish the Meadowlark Accessibility Fund, which will provide grants to any resident who needs accommodation modifications. Margaret stared at him in shock. $50,000 was likely everything he'd saved from his years as an electrician. "Mr. Stone," a reporter called out, "why are you making this grand gesture? Is this an attempt to win back the governor's affections?" Jackson's smile was sad but genuine. "No. This is an attempt to finally do the right thing. Governor Wheeler deserves a community that celebrates her presence, not one that tries to hide her away. And I deserve to live with the consequences of my choices, all of them." Chapter 7. The letter that changed everything that evening. After the reporters had finally dispersed and the neighborhood had returned to uneasy quiet, Margaret found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a letter written in Jackson's familiar handwriting, along with the small velvet ring box. "Maggie, I've started this letter 1,000 times over the past 23 years. Tonight I finally found the courage to finish it. I know, I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I know that decades of regret don't erase the pain I caused, but I need you to know that leaving you wasn't about not loving you. It was about loving you too much to drag you into the mess I'd made of my life. I was weak then. I chose the coward's path, thinking I was being noble. I convinced myself that you'd be better off hating me than knowing the truth. I was wrong about everything except one thing: you deserved better than what I could give you then. But Maggie, these past few weeks watching you from a distance, seeing the incredible woman you've become, the lives you've touched, the good you've done, I realize something that terrifies me. You still deserve better than what I can give you now. You're a governor. You're respected, accomplished, surrounded by people who value your intellect and leadership. I'm an electrician with a past full of mistakes and a future that holds. It's nothing but quiet redemption at best. So I'm not asking you to love me again. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to take this ring not as a proposal, but as an apology. It was meant to symbolize a promise I was too broken to keep. Now I hope it can symbolize a different kind of promise, that I will spend whatever time I have left making sure you never doubt your worth again. The ramp stays. The fund is real, and I'll disappear again if that's what you need. All my love. Always, Jackson P. S. I still have that book of poetry you loved. Nerutha. Love is so short, forgetting is so long. Never forgot, Maggie. Not for a single day. Margaret read the letter 3 times before opening the ring box. The diamond caught the lamplight, throwing tiny rainbows across her walls. Such a simple thing to carry so much history, so much pain, so much hope. She was still holding it when Sarah knocked softly on her door. The reporters are gone, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Margaret's bed. Jackson Stone caused quite a stir. $50,000, Maggie. He gave up everything he had. I know. And he resigned from the HOA. I know. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying her sister's face. What are you going to do? It was the question Margaret had been asking herself since the moment Jackson walked back into her life. The safe answer was to let him go again, to protect her carefully constructed peace from the chaos of unresolved love. The wise answer was to acknowledge that too much time had passed. Too much pain had accumulated between them. But sometimes, Margaret realized, the heart demanded answers that had nothing to do with safety or wisdom. I'm going to trust him, she said finally. Maybe not with my heart, not yet, but with the truth about what I need. Redemption under Willow Tress Margaret found. Jackson, the next morning, at the old cemetery on the edge of town, kneeling beside a simple headstone marked Linda Marie Stone. He'd placed wildflowers by the marker, the same prairie roses he'd once picked for Margaret during their summer of love. She would have liked you, he said without turning around as Margaret's wheelchair approached on the gravel path. Linda always said I needed to stop running from ghosts. Tell me about her. Jackson settled back on his heels, his eyes distant. She was a librarian. Found me reading in the corner of the Denver Public Library every evening after work, trying to educate myself out of the mess I'd made. She said anyone who read poetry that intently couldn't be entirely lost. She sounds wonderful. She was patient, kind, steady. Everything you were, but quieter about it. He glanced at Margaret. She knew about you. I told her everything when we got serious. She said she could live with loving a man whose heart belonged partly to someone else, as long as I was honest about it. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. That's incredibly generous. She was an incredibly generous woman. But Maggie, I need you to know, I loved Linda completely. Our marriage wasn't a consolation prize or a way to forget you. It was real, and it was good. It's different from what we had, but real. I'm glad, Margaret said, and meant it. I'm glad you found happiness, even if it was brief. Jackson stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. What about you? David Wheelard. Did you love him? It was a fair question, considering everything they'd shared. Margaret considered her words carefully. David was a good man who loved me deeply and asked for nothing more than I could give. He knew about you, too knew that part of my heart was locked away. Accepted that. Built a life with me anyway. We had 5 good years before the cancer. Took him? No children? No. The accident. Well, it complicated things. And by then we were both older, set in our ways. She smiled sadly. I poured all that maternal energy into my work instead. All those bills protecting children, those education initiatives. Maybe that's enough. They stood in comfortable silence, both lost in memories of loves that had shaped them. Finally, Jackson spoke. I read your letter. Margaret's heart skipped. And I think you're right. I was protecting myself more than protecting you. I was so afraid of being unworthy that I never gave you the chance to decide for yourself. Jackson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. He turned to face her fully. Anything. If we tried again, if we somehow found our way back to each other, would you stay? Even when things got difficult? Even when my political career creates complications? Even when this chair makes simple things challenging? Would you stay, or would you run at the first sign of trouble? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning 23 years of doubt and regret. Jackson's answer would determine whether they moved forward or said goodbye forever. Maggie, he said quietly, I ran once because I was a coward who thought he was being noble. Spent 2 decades learning the difference. If you give me another chance, if you're willing to risk trusting me again, swear on Linda's grave that I will stay. I will fight for us, fight beside you, fight through whatever comes. I will never, ever run from you again. His face, searching for any sign of the uncertainty that had driven him away before. Instead, she saw something she'd never seen in the young Jackson: absolute certainty. The kind of bone-deep commitment that comes only from understanding the true cost of loss. I believe you, she said finally. But Jackson, this won't be like before. I'm not the same person I was at 23. My life is complicated, public, demanding. I can't promise you quiet happiness or simple love. I can only promise you truth in whatever part of my heart isn't too scarred to trust again. That's all I want, he said, dropping to one knee beside her wheelchair. Truth, trust, and whatever chance you're willing to give us. He pulled the ring box from his pocket, but instead of opening it, he set it gently in her hands. I'm not asking you to marry me, Maggie. Not yet. Too much has happened for grand gestures and easy answers. But I'm asking if you'll let me court you properly this time. Let me prove that the man I've become is worthy of the woman you are. Margaret looked down at the box in her hands, then up at Jackson's face, older, weathered, but blazing with the same intensity that had captured her heart decades ago. One condition, she said. Name it. No more secrets. No matter how ugly, how complicated, how potentially painful. If we do this, we do it with complete honesty. Jackson smiled, the same crooked grin that had made her fall in love with him. In Murphy's saloon, all those years ago. Deal, he said. No more secrets. Chapter 9. Building bridges 3 months later. Margaret stood with Jackson's steady support at the podium of the Willow Creek Community Center, addressing a packed room of residents, reporters, and state officials. The occasion was the grand opening of the Meadowlark Accessibility Initiative, a program that had grown far beyond Jackson's initial donation to become a model for inclusive community development. Today represents more than just wheelchair ramps and accessible sidewalks, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. It represents a community choosing to embrace all its members, regardless of their physical capabilities. In the audience, she could see Jackson beaming with pride, his eyes never leaving her face. Beside him sat Sarah and her husband, both wearing accessibility champion pins. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Mrs. Chen, who'd run on a platform of inclusive community policies, nodded approvingly from the front row. But I want to be clear about something, Margaret continued. This initiative exists because one man had the courage to admit his mistakes and spend his life savings to make things right. Jackson Stone turned a moment of personal failure into a community-wide success, and that's the kind of leadership we need more of in this world. The applause was thunderous, but Margaret only had eyes for Jackson's reaction. She watched him duck his head modestly, uncomfortable with the praise but no longer running from accountability. After the ceremony, they found themselves alone on the same bridge where they'd confronted their past 3 months earlier. The evening air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant laughter of children playing in the new accessible playground. "Are you happy?" Jackson asked, his arm around Margaret's shoulders as she sat in her chair beside the wooden railing. "I'm content," Margaret said carefully. "Happy feels presumptuous somehow, like tempting fate." Jackson laughed softly. "You know what I've learned about fate? It's not something that happens to us. It's something we create through our choices. Is that what we're doing? Creating fate? Maybe. Or maybe we're just two people who are tired of letting fear make our decisions." Margaret leaned into his warmth, marveling at how right it felt to be in his arms again. These 3 months had been a revelation, not the passionate whirlwind of their youth, but something deeper and more sustainable. They'd taken things slowly, carefully, building trust, like craftsmen constructing something meant to last. They'd had their first fight 6 weeks ago over Margaret's decision to run for re-election without consulting him. The old Jackson might have seen it as evidence that she didn't need him and retreated into himself. The new Jackson had stood his ground, argued his point, and supported her decision completely once he understood her reasoning. They'd also had their first real romantic moment just 2 weeks ago, when Jackson had finally kissed her again during a quiet dinner at her house. It had been tentative at first, both of them afraid of moving too fast, but when Margaret had pulled him closer and whispered, "I've missed this," 23 years of longing had crystallized into something new and beautiful. "I have something for you," Jackson said now, reaching into his jacket pocket. Margaret's heart jumped. "Jackson, if that's what I think it is, it's not a proposal," he said quickly. "Well, not exactly. It's more of a ... proposition." He pulled out not the familiar ring box, but a set of house keys. "I bought the lot next to Sarah's," he explained. "Had an architect draw up plans for a fully accessible home with a guest suite for visiting dignitaries, a home office suitable for gubernatorial work, and a workshop where an old electrician can keep his hands busy. Single story, wide doorways, roll-in shower, the works." Margaret stared at the keys in amazement. "You bought land?" "I bought land. In both our names, actually, though we're not. That is, if you're not. I mean, there's no pressure for you too." He took a deep breath and started again. "Maggie, I want to build a life with you. Not recapture what we had before, but create something new. Something that fits who we are now." Jackson ... let me finish. "I know it's presumptuous. I know we're still figuring things out. But I also know that I'm 51 years old, and I've wasted too many years already. I want to wake up next to you. I want to grow old with you. I want to argue about politics and make you coffee in the morning and hold your hand during scary movies." He pressed the keys into her palm. "I want to marry you, Margaret Rose Wheeler. Not because we loved each other once, but because we love each other now. It's better, deeper, more honestly than we ever did before." Margaret looked down at the keys, then up at Jackson's face. In his eyes, she saw not the desperate passion of their youth, but something far more precious, steadfast commitment, backed by mature understanding of love's true cost. "Yes," she said simply.
Yes to the house.
Yes to the house, or yes to all of it. The house, the marriage, the growing old together. Yes, to building something new instead of trying to resurrect something old. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in decades. "Yes to trusting you with my whole heart, even though it terrifies me."
Jackson's smile was brilliant.
This time he did pull out the ring box. "Margaret Rose Wheeler," he said formally, "will you marry me? Will you let me love you for whatever time we have left? And will you promise to tell me immediately if I do anything stupid enough to risk losing you again?" Margaret laughed the first, completely carefree sound she'd made since before her accident. "Yes, Jackson Stone. But I have one amendment to add to that proposal." "Name it." "Promise me that when we fight, and we will fight, you won't shut down and pull away. Promise me that when things get difficult, you'll talk to me instead of trying to protect me from your problems." "I promise," he said solemnly, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 23 years for this moment. Epilogue. Love Under Western Skies, 1 year later. The wedding of Governor Margaret Wheeler and Jackson Stone took place in the garden of their new home. Surrounded by prairie wildflowers and towering cottonwoods, Margaret wore her mother's lace dress, altered to accommodate her seated position, while Jackson wore a simple gray suit and a smile that could have powered the entire county. Sarah served as matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes as she watched. Her sister married the man who'd first broken, then ultimately healed her heart. Mrs. Chen officiated. Having been ordained online specifically for the occasion, the wheelchair-accessible pathway Jackson had built through their garden was lined with luminarias, creating a river of golden light that led from the house to the ceremony site. "You know," Margaret said during their first dance, she and her. Chair. Jackson kneeling beside her, their hands intertwined. "I used to think love was about finding someone perfect. And now?" Jackson asked, spinning her wheelchair gently in time with the music. "Now I know it's about finding someone whose imperfections fit perfectly with your own." As the sun set behind them, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret realized that some love stories aren't about fairy tale endings. Sometimes they're about second chances, about forgiveness, about two damaged souls choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their mistakes. Sometimes love isn't about riding off into the sunset together. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay and watch that sunset side by side, night after night, for whatever time you're given, under the endless western sky. With stars beginning to appear overhead and the sound of friends and family celebrating around them, Margaret and Jackson finally found their forever. It looked nothing like what they'd imagined at 23, but it was infinitely more precious for having.